I'm a business development manager within research and innovation in the University of Canterbury. Today's presentation is about how our particular university engages with industry, and we engage with industry in a number of ways. They are obviously suppliers to the university. They recruit our graduates. They sponsor a number of events. But this particular presentation is around the commercial engagement and how we as academic and industry partners work together to deliver meaningful and useful research outputs. So just as a kind of introduction to the institution, we're what we call a medium-sized institution. We've got about 18,000 full-time students spread across undergraduate and postgraduates. It's perhaps important to understand that this university and most universities are incorporated by Act of Parliament. So, we're not a commercial entity per se, and we're not a government department. We sort of sit in between. We have a constitution that requires the advancement of knowledge and the dissemination and maintenance thereof by teaching and research. And so this constitution, the advancement of knowledge, is an important part of our function. We take those sort of ideas of dissemination and maintenance of teaching and research very seriously. In terms of our student population, we run 5 colleges on campus, but the 2 most significant and relevant colleges to this discussion today are probably engineering and science. Engineering accounts for in excess of 25% of all students, and science is not far behind, with just less than 25% of total student population doing some form of science program. We also support 1,200 PhD students, which reflects a fairly strong research focus, and those are spread across all disciplines, obviously. And the PhD students, which they are really the heavy lifters when it comes to research on campus and in this institution. So the availability of PhD students and their work within a lot of the programs and the specific activities, they represent a significant manpower resource that we use quite a lot in the research environment. We also support a number of research centres and research institutions. These are groupings of academics and research activity into specific domains and specific focus. Some of those can be quite blue sky. They can be quite far over the horizon type of research, but others are very closely engaged with industry and work pretty much full time with industry engagement, and they support a lot of very industry-focused research with an objective to support essentially those industry partners as a type of outsourced R&D. We have a strategic vision, a tangata tū, tangata ora, and that is around being empowered, engaged, and making a difference. And I think that speaks to the sort of commitment of the UoC as an institution to work with partners, especially in industry, around research. I mean, obviously, as a tertiary institution, we are fully focused on producing research of and human capability around human capital around our graduates, which go into industry and support industry activity. So I work for the Research and Innovation. Now, University of Canterbury is possibly different to other universities in New Zealand and elsewhere. We run essentially the group that I belong to is a combined research office and a commercial office. So in some respects, we're a cradle to grave kind of service unit within the institution. We help our academics generate funding opportunities through applications into contestable funding rounds, which are typically things like the MB's Endeavour round. And we also help our academics support negotiated contracts. So at the front end of a contract, we want to set up the contract in such a way that both parties will get the best result out of it. We also engage in other activities, other income generation activities such as consulting and license revenue. But we also maintain an ongoing engagement with stakeholders such as industry, government, community, and other organisations, and we try to maintain a type of engagement with those organisations to support their interaction with their academic community. The other part of our office is around IP management. We look after the tech transfer function, if you like, the ability to shift intellectual property out into industry as quickly as possible so it can be made use of. So just looking at some of the numbers, as an institution, we currently have in the order of about $144 million of research contracts at all stages. So that could be contracts that are just starting out or in their final year. But we have a book value of about $144 million spread across 336 different contracts. Annually, in terms of the billable income that we return on those contracts. So last year we essentially billed and recovered $41 million of income. And at the same time, we engaged in a significant stream of consulting fee-for-service type activity. And that brought in a revenue of $4.5 million. I'll talk a little bit about some of those revenue streams later. As an office, we also sort of manage the IP portfolio, and the IP portfolio that the University of Canterbury generates. We run a patent program, or from the point of view of protecting certain key intellectual property assets. And, obviously that's an expensive ongoing proposition. And so we have to moderate how we look at our patent portfolio from the point of view of those patents that have commercializable potential. And we will actively manage those until we can find an industry partner that we can shift that off to. And just by the way of spin-outs, we've done a number of spin-outs last year, 3 particular spin-outs, and most of those were around deep tech of some description. So if we look at the instruments of, again, just thinking, going back to the thrust of this presentation, it's around the commercial engagement. So if we think about what types of instruments of engagement we use, these are all based on a if you pay, you own type of proposition. So this is direct funding kind of between the industry partner and us as an academic institution. If you like, the peak engagement type is an R&D partnership. These are typically longer term, multidisciplinary and bespoke, based on a longer program of different projects spread across the institution. We have a couple of those currently in train at the moment, and they are long-term relationships that have been working quite effectively for a number of years. Then from a contracting point of view, a negotiated contracting point of view, we can engage with industry around contracted research. So this is where there is a specific research assignment proposition that is to be explored, and that's an academic-led fee-based research service. And that is the pursuit of new knowledge. It's around looking at opportunities to develop new research and new research outcomes. And then we also support a form of fee-for-service academic consulting, where our academics can work with industry partners on specific activity, which is generally around known knowledge and the application of either our intellectual property or the tools of trade that our academics have for problem resolution or idea generation. And then at a student level, we commercially engage with industry partners around a number of sponsorship opportunities. At the postgraduate level, that's both master's and PhD projects, and we work either directly with those industry partners or through funding mechanisms such as Callaghan Innovation Fellowships, etc. in New Zealand, where we can support master's and PhD students with industry-facing projects which deliver industry-facing benefits. And then at an undergraduate level, there are various opportunities for industry partners to engage with the undergraduates, and there's two key values out of this that can be generated out of these sponsorships. It gives industry partners a chance to look at students in their undergraduate years, especially in those final year projects where they may be moving on to a postgraduate opportunity. And again, industry partners can look at individual students and assess their sort of their ability to connect with them, and maybe look at sponsoring them going forward into the master's and PhD programs. Summer projects and internships, I mean, they've been an important part of commercial engagement, again, supporting students both from a work experience point of view, but more importantly from a sort of long interview proposition for industry partners to look at students and, again, think about a sponsorship program which could culminate in active employment. So I alluded to the idea that back at the start of this presentation, that indeed industry and academia are two different organizational they have two different organizational languages and structures, and there are easy ways for the engagement to be confused. And so there are some rules of engagement with academia which I think are worth discussing. These are based on observations and some sense of best practice, but they're by no means a definitive set, but we tend to talk in this type of language such that there is no confusion as to the nature of a research engagement with an academic institution, especially around the idea of eventually the research being of value and producing an intellectual property or some form of transferable technology. So if we look at this particular use case, which is, again, industry academic engagement via a negotiated research contract. So universities, they have many, many front doors. You can enter in a university through directly through an academic department, through a marketing group, or through a research and innovation. And generally we find that the commercial teams, such as the business development team and research and innovation, tend to be the best way of entering into an organization, because they tend to have an overview of the organization and the type of touch points and where your particular industry needs may be best suited. A key understanding regarding research contracts is while they are not a design or build or software development type project, they can't be expressed as a set of definitive milestones with a view that at the end of the project there will be a prescribed outcome. These outputs tend to not be guaranteed, and that's not for any evasive sort of purpose, but the reality is research does not follow a straight line. And in some instances, there is so much research going on in certain areas that we can't guarantee a potentially unique outcome. Likewise, research outputs are generally low technology readiness level, and so they don't tend to be commercializable in the form that they will come out of the university. They tend to be requiring more commercial input to turn them into a commercializable product. But the key to engagement with academia is in fact engagement through that research process, always being available to engage with the research team to discuss the outcome. Regular reporting is engaged on in most cases, and having an active engagement with the research team when you've entered into a negotiated research contract ensures the sort of direction of research tracks according to both parties' understanding. And likewise with IP ownership is an ongoing discussion. It should be engaged with early, and it should be engaged with throughout the program, such that there are no surprises as you reach the end of the research outcome. So I mentioned before that a key function of the Research and Innovation Group at University of Canterbury is around tech transfer, and that's about getting research outputs out into the real world. It's worth noting that UoC is not a commercializing entity. We have historically in the past tried to commercialize and run our own spin-outs, but that is no longer a core function of UoC, and in fact the innovation ecosystem has grown up a lot since our first endeavors, and we engage very heavily with the incubator communities, and such as tech incubators such as Bridge West. And whilst we may host student level incubators, or in fact founder incubators, we tend to engage very broadly across the ecosystem now. So it's our with our research outputs, especially where those have been associated with a contracted engagement, the industry partner will commercialise those, or the industry partner engages with the innovation ecosystem in New Zealand. So the other in terms of generating IP, the inventors, often a number of different groups may be involved in that. We've got academic staff as employees of UC, postgraduate students who may be students who are paying their own way through the university, or who may be sponsored as part of a university engagement, and we may use external collaborators. And again, it's useful to understand the composition of the research team, and that the individual researcher contribution to the intellectual property is crucial to understanding ownership and transferable rights. We've had circumstances where there's been disagreement between the inventors, and the only way that we can ever get a resolution is to get all of those inventors in a room at the same time to come up and agree with their individual contribution. Our role in tech transfer is to make sure that intellectual property makes its way to the industry partner, and it's based on a clear ownership and an agreed protection strategy. And in that case, in addition to that, you know, as well as the new IP that is transferred, if that new IP requires any background IP from UC to affect the commercialization of that new intellectual property, then one of our roles is to ensure that that background IP can be licensed appropriately to ensure the successful commercialization of any new IP generated. So it's probably worth noting at this stage that, perhaps like industry, innovation IP is changing. We notice this a lot in our research propositions these days. It is increasingly algorithmic and data-based. And again, the assessment regarding patentability, I mean, patents are hard to get for algorithms, and they're slightly easier to invalidate. And we know that data is not patentable, although it is subject to copyright. Increasingly, we're seeing from a innovation IP point of view, a trade secret protocol tends to be a more useful proposition when there is data aggregation and analytics involved. And again, the caveat around that is, provided that that particular trade secret, that there is truly a secret involved, it has value, and that the institution and the industry partner take reasonable steps to ensure that that protocol is adhered to during the conduct of the research. And interestingly, we're also noticing that you know, as the way that intellectual property can be commercialized and turned into a business proposition, increasingly things such as software as a service actually is in itself as a useful protection for data and executable applications, due to the fact that there are very limited disclosure and no disclosure requirements and transfer of source code. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of case studies around research contract that we have, what typically demonstrates how we would engage with an industry partner. So this particular research contract was around investigating new methods of signal optimization. The particular industry partner was an active in the telecommunications market and in a particularly competitive sector of that market, and was using some of our industry-facing R&D teams to look at signal optimization and investigate a particular new form of optimization. Their expectation that if the research could come up with that optimization algorithm, then that would provide a significant market differentiation opportunity. So the first process that we ensure at the contract negotiation stage is that the IP is clearly defined, and how all parties involved in the project have a clear understanding that this particular project, as an industry-funded project, has a clear pathway for IP to transfer to the industry partner. So the contract has very clear clauses relating to new IP generation, and as I talked about before, any background IP required to support that new IP would be made available through licensing. Likewise, when we looked at the researchers, in this particular instance, there was UC staff and an external collaborator. So those researchers were subjected to the assignment arrangements early on in the research contract. So there was no ambiguity or misunderstanding as to the end result and how we would treat the new IP. And during the time of the project, we understood the IP was likely to be algorithmic, so we implemented a reasonably robust trade secret protocol, and that involved fundamentals around non-disclosure and a refraining from any type of academic publishing, because that is perhaps one of the leakiest propositions where intellectual property can enter the market. And that first process was very much around the start of the contract. And then at the end of the contract, there was a tech transfer process. And again, this is the type of process that University of Canterbury generally follows around working with industry partners as funders. UC staff are bound by policy under these circumstances to undertake assignment to UC. And that's generally clearly understood. And we used a mechanism to enable the external collaborator to assign, and again, they understood that was a prerequisite to their involvement in the project. And then likewise, at the end, we formally assign the intellectual property through a deed of assignment such that the industry partner has an assurity that they can use that IP. The key outcome in this particular instance was that the industry partner integrated that IP through its product development cycle, and indeed help secure significant new business in critical overseas markets. The second case study is a more straightforward license agreement. This is where the university is licensing some of its intellectual property to a deep tech startup. And again, one of the principles of our licensing agreements, especially with the startup community, is that we want to focus on impact in a real world. We want to transfer intellectual property into meaningful vehicles that IP can be exploited to make a difference. And we like to do it in what we call a do no harm policy. So there is no point in us punishing a startup early with fees and structures that are harmful to the success of the startup, because joint success is a key part of supporting the startup community and shifting intellectual property out of the university into an industry environment. So one of the things we do around the licensing agreement is we use a transparency. And so we like to do joint development, because that joint development is a way in which the partnership can be built, and the term sheet is jointly developed by both partners to ensure future success. And again, that's based on what we would see as relatively straightforward industry norms around terms, subject to negotiation and agreement by both parties. We also understand that university involvement in licenses can be problematic, especially when it comes to future VC investment. So our term sheet and the eventual license does have a buyout clause such that the university's relationship to the intellectual property can be removed if that is considered appropriate as the startup moves into further funding investment rounds. And finally, just to nail it home, I mean, whilst we could drive a licensing agreement out of research and innovation, we tend to use external deal professionals such that there's an arm's length objectivity around the final agreement, and that all parties sense that there is a neutral conclusion to the agreement. In this particular case, there's been a very successful startup, and based on the licensing and the type of technology they've got, they have attracted $1 million in future development investment, which is it's a great result for both parties. So just in concluding, I guess, you know, UC, like most universities, is very, very keen for industry engagement, and it's a core principle in our institutional strategy. Impact and the ability to demonstrate useful and meaningful transfer into different parts of the of our stakeholders, be it industry or the community. That's an increasing focus for all institutions, and especially University of Canterbury. the industry, engaging with the university is different to a commercial setting, and has a number of interesting and unique benefits. So poaching our postgrads is totally fine. I mean, that's one of the things we hope that industry engagement with universities results in, and there's a pathway for postgraduates and undergraduates to move into industry. And I think, like we talked about before, industry, that research IP is changing, and that no doubt reflects industry's experience with new digital assets. That concludes my presentation, and thank you for your time.
Getting on. So thank you so much for that. I mean, really insightful. And I think one of the valuable takeaways from this is that our universities are working quite closely with our industries. And there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill sets sitting in the universities that the rest of the community needs to be aware of. And, the work of you and your team is at the forefront of this, and bringing you into this conversation is such a valuable piece, and the timing for it is critical as well. I guess a question that I've got is, there's a lot we can do in this space. What are, in your experience, some of the things that you think has worked really well when engaging with industry?
Look, I think we have to treat it as a partnership. And the partnership requires both parties to continue to have open discussion. Sometimes things don't go well. It's like any other relationship. You need to keep working at it. I think the key engagement opportunity is around continuing to discuss and reflect on the nature of the research and how it's progressing.
No, thank you for that. And so thank you again for your time.